All right. Welcome again, everybody, to this July 25th. Geez, I need to work on my dates there. Summer Saturday. Today, we are talking about the food of people who were enslaved in the 18th century. So we're doing 3 activities related to that. We'll spend a little bit of time talking about the rations that people who were enslaved received from the people who owned them. This is a really interesting and challenging topic. And then we'll spend some time focusing on 2 recipes made by people who were enslaved during the 18th century, some of which have continued to exist even to today. These recipes are the ancestors of some that we find in modern cookbooks. So we're going to get started with food rations. And you may want to have some of these supplies with you. They're not necessary, but they will help you get a visual understanding of some of the foods that we're talking about in this next section. I've got to make sure I've got mine over here in the back corner too. All right, let's get started with those food rations. So this activity is going to take 2 halves. We're going to spend some time first looking at specific documentation that gives us very definite measurements of food that was allocated to people who were enslaved by slave owners. And then the second half of the activity, we're going to look at some of the things that enslaved people had access to through other means. So we're going to look at some images of these foodstuffs and talk about a little bit about how we know they had access to them. So let's get started. So these first 2 quotes are from a young man named Philip Vickers-Fithian. He worked as a tutor at Nominee Hall, which was owned by Robert Carter. Carter had hundreds of slaves, and Fithian, who was from New Jersey, where slavery did still happen, but not to the extent that it does in Virginia in the 18th century, had some really startling moments when he encountered people who were enslaved and the conditions that he found them in. So he left us these 2 quotes that you can see on screen. I'm going to give you a moment to take a look at those 2 quotes, and I've highlighted the amount of food that they were allotted. Now, looking at these 2 quotes, is there anything that stands out to anybody about them? Maybe the measurements, the kind of food they're getting, who is doing the actual allotment and giving out the allowances. The lack of meat, yeah, absolutely. There is very little meat being given out in allotments, and in some cases, no meat at all. Anything else stand out to anybody? What kind of meat I'm seeing in the chat, and corn in what form? That's a great question. We don't know what kind of meat in this case. In some later ones, we'll see what kind of meat. And the corn is probably whole grain corn. So it's probably been stripped off the cob, but it's whole corn. Those are all great things to have noticed. And so let's think about quantity for a little bit. A peck is a measurement that we don't still use today. That seems like a really odd measurement for us to be using. The closest modern equivalent to a peck is those 3-gallon jugs that we asked you to get. So this represents about a peck. in today's measurements. If we're thinking about that in the 18th century, a peck of corn, whole corn, probably ground down to about half that amount. So we're talking maybe 1.5 gallons of cornmeal each week. And that cornmeal made things like corn mush and fritters and cornbread. Comparatively speaking, that amount of flour, whether it was cornmeal or wheat flour, was probably going onto the mason's table all in one meal. So 1.5 gallons of some kind of flour was at the mason's table in one meal, and an enslaved person had to make do with that much cornmeal over the span of a week. Did people in the 18th century consume as much meat as we do? That's a question in the chat. Great question. They're probably consuming as much or more meat than we do today, depending on personal choice and diet. So comparatively speaking, between what we see in this quote, a pound of meat a head, that's about, say, a pound of ground meat. Typically today, we would make that into about 4 hamburgers. So that's a little less than the size of a card deck of meat per person per day. Whereas the Masons had on their table probably a whole roast fowl of some sort, whether that's a goose or a turkey or a chicken, multiple varieties of fish, roast beef, roast pork. They probably have 3 to 4 meat dishes on the table each meal. And they're not eating the entirety of those dishes at one meal. They use them as leftovers. So they have dinner about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and then they eat a supper meal in the evening, and they're eating leftovers from that dinner meal. But comparatively speaking, the Masons had access to about a deck of cards worth of meat or more at each meal, and a person who was enslaved had access to less than one of these a day. So great thoughts, great questions. Let's look at our second quote. This one is from Mount Vernon. It's not by somebody who lived at Mount Vernon. It's by a gentleman named Julian Niemcewicz. He was a gentleman from Poland and came and visited the newly formed United States in the 1790s and made this remark about the allotments given to people enslaved at Mount Vernon. So you can see the 1 gallon of maize. Maize here is corn. That makes about 1.5 quarts a day. A quart is about this much. And the salt herrings, again, we're looking at 20 salt herrings a month. And again, the meat on salt herrings is about the size of a deck of cards. So they're getting less than this per day. Any thoughts or questions on this one? All right, doesn't look like it, but that's okay. If you have questions later, you're more than welcome to drop them in the chat. This last quote is not a primary source document. Mary Thompson is a historian who currently works at Mount Vernon. And she estimates, based on the documentation that she has encountered, that weekly, like other places, people who were in slavery were receiving a peck of cornmeal. In this case, it is cornmeal and not whole corn. They're also getting pickled meat, which seems kind of weird to us today. We don't typically pickle meat, but that was very common in the 18th century. They're getting 4 salted herrings, still not as much as people who were free in the 18th century. Again, we're looking at that deck of cards sized container. But they're also getting 4 fluid ounces of molasses a week, which is about a half a cup. Not a whole lot if you think about the fact that there are recipes out there for gingerbread in the 18th century, which use a cup and a half of molasses per one recipe, but it did provide some different flavorings. Ooh, fun question in the chat. Is pickled beef similar to what we would call corned beef? They are somewhat different, but concept is similar. Corning beef allows it to keep longer. Corned beef tends to be really, really salty though, and pickled beef or pickled pork would be very tangy because it's pickled typically in vinegar. But great question. So these are the documents that we really have access to. We don't actually know what people like Nell at Gunston Hall were eating. We don't know what a young man named Liberty, who served as a carpenter, we don't know what they were eating at Gunston Hall, but we can start to draw some conclusions based on what we see in documents like these from Monticello, Mount Vernon, and Nominee Hall. We also see some other things going on, but generally speaking, do we think this is enough food for somebody to live on each week? Feel free to type your comment in the chat or unmute yourself and shout it out. What do you think, Laura? Do you think you could live on a peck of cornmeal, a pound of pickled meat? Yeah, I see it, Helene. Yeah, and Carl. No, not really. And you're asking great questions. Were they allowed to farm, and did they supplement their diet with kitchen gardens? And you are hitting the nail on the head. Absolutely, they were allowed kitchen gardens. And they also sometimes were allowed to fish, sometimes were allowed to hunt. And we also know that they scavenged and in some cases stole to add to their diets. And they did some pretty amazing things with what they were able to accumulate aside from the things that they were allotted. So, oh, great question too. We have a question about, was this per person or per family? This is per person. This is the allotment per person, and it is per person for somebody who is fully able to work. People who are older, people who are younger. So there's an enslaved woman we know the Masons had called Nan Oldgate, who was past her labor, was the description. And she probably received less food than this for herself. There were young girls like Pris and Penny who were probably 5 to 6 when they first came to Gunston Hall and would have received less than this. But I see some great questions in the chat about hunting and fruit, and I'm going to turn it over to Laura, who is going to talk about some of those things.
Good morning, everyone. Yeah, everyone's getting exactly into what we're going to go to next. So I'm so glad everyone's thinking in that direction already. So we do know that enslaved workers had a lot of different ways that they tried to supplement what they were eating. So some of the things are things you've already mentioned. Some of them are things that maybe you didn't think of before, but hopefully we'll get to chew over it a little bit as we go through. So we'll start with fish, because that was one of the questions we had that was asked. So in addition to the salted fish, they also had access to fresh fish, and they're coming from the same place essentially. Because Gunston Hall and all that farmland sits directly on the Potomac River, and the Potomac River has all these nice small creeks that go out into the farmland, enslaved workers were both fishing in a commercial way, in really large scale in the spring. This is when shad and herring were being brought in nets. And so a lot of those would be prepared to be salted in large barrels, and then that's what's being rationed. However, at the same time that they're doing that fishing, you also have them bringing in other fish that isn't going to be salted, but they can eat fresh then. And then throughout the rest of the year, different kinds of fish are in season, and those could be eaten fresh as well, or salted. And so this is part of the reason why you see salt as in the ration group for certain enslaved workers, depending on different plantations, is they're using it that way. However, one of the really important things about the difference between salted fish and fresh fish is how you prepare it. Salted fish, you can't fry it because it's so tough. It's been salted, it's been dehydrated. So when you prepare it, you actually will soak it to try to get rid of as much of that salt as possible. However, if you have fresh fish, you can fry this. There's also other ways of preparing it. We have a nice picture of what's called planking, which is where you actually split your fish open and nail it to a board. And when you nail it to the board, you can put a fire in front of it and it smokes it. So it's a nice indirect way of cooking. Smoking can help prolong the life of that meat, but you can also eat it fresh as well. Part of the reason we know that they're eating fish like this is thanks to archaeological evidence. Both at Gunston Hall and other plantations like Mount Vernon and Monticello, where we've had surveys done near dwellings of enslaved workers, we find fish bones. And the good news about that is it confirms what we already thought. And guess what? We have a very particular kind of fish that we know about, and it might be one that you're not so familiar with. It's the funny looking fellow. They are called a garfish. They have a very specific kind of bone, and so that's how we're able to pinpoint and say,
Scales.
Garfish.
It's their scales, Laura.
It's the scales, yes. So
Yeah.
for those of you unfamiliar with fish, fish can have 4 different kinds of scales, and because of the particular shape of those scales, we can pinpoint and say garfish. Other kinds of fish that were popular, such as shad, were very bony, and so those also are easy to identify by that way. Now, other kinds of meat that they might have had, so in addition to the things that they're receiving as rations, they could hunt. So someone mentioned about would they be allowed to own guns. We do have evidence that some enslaved workers were permitted to have firearms for this purpose. Others would have been hunting or by way of setting traps, and so you would have snares. And so this, of course, is going to lead to a completely different set of animals. So what kind of animals have you seen here in Virginia that you think someone might be tempted to try to hunt or trap? We've even cheated, we've put the answers up on the screen. Oh, deer is a good one. And so venison, definitely popular during the period. Gunston Hall actually had a deer park. And so this was considered something of a gentry level food. So it's less likely that enslaved workers would have had been hunting them, as they would have been sort of off limits and relegated to, this is what the Masons and the Washingtons would have been hunting for recreational purposes. Rabbits and squirrels, definitely. You can also see we've got raccoon and possum on there as well. And birds were also popular. So wild turkey, I'm sure if you've spent any time in the mid-Atlantic region, you have seen wild turkeys before, but we also have pheasants and grouse as well, which are fairly smallish birds, ground living birds. And those are birds that you can also catch either by hunting or by snaring. Ooh, muskrats. Ooh, I did not see that one come up, but I would be super curious to know. I'm not sure how prolific muskrats are in our region, but they are more populous farther south you go. So it is quite possible that in more southern plantations, they're making use of that. A lot of what we talk about when we talk about these alternative foods that enslaved workers are sourcing that are non-rations, they were very creative in how they decided to, what was edible and what was not. So that's a good question. So as we're sort of taking our woodland route and looking at all these animals, while you're walking along, setting your traps, you would also potentially come along with nuts, berries, different kinds of roots. All of these could be foraged. We also have examples of fruit that comes from that. So some of you may or may not be familiar with the pawpaw tree, which is indigenous to this area. And it has a very interesting fruit. It's almost like a custard on the inside. It's a bit like a banana flavor. But they don't fruit quite as regularly as other trees. So they were never domesticated in the same way that apple trees or pear trees or peach trees were. However, if you come across one, the fruit is incredibly edible, very delicious. And so that's something they could gather and eat as well. So that's something sweet that they could have. But we also, oops, I was like, Lacey, could I get you to pop forward a slide? Oh my goodness, I forgot a couple more animals, but this is good because we'll sort of loop back into the idea of farming. So you can get animals in the wild. You might also have domesticated animals. We have evidence that enslaved workers could have hogs and chickens. And sometimes these chickens are referred to as dunghill fowl. And the reason for that is because they're mixed breeds. They're not necessarily one particular kind of chicken. They all just happen to lay eggs together. They do their business together. So you get this nice, well-rounded mixture collectively called by this name. Now you might be thinking, are they eating them? Not right away, because with chickens, we're very fortunate that you can get eggs from them. And from eggs come more chickens, and you can sell those chickens, or you can eat the eggs. But if you eat the chicken on the right away, you don't get anything else. So they were using these chickens very strategically as a way to, multiply their food source. Hogs are really great because they grow quite quickly compared to other kinds of animals. And during the 18th century, it was very common to just let your hogs roam as they wished and feed themselves. So this is a good option for enslaved workers who have trouble feeding their own families, let alone livestock. The hogs will take care of themselves. You bring them in when it comes close to slaughter time, fatten them up a little bit, and you use just about everything from that animal. So it goes a long way, which is good. You can also smoke it or salt it to help preserve the meat and make it last longer. So I'll pause for a second. Any questions about our animals or anything we've said so far? I see mushrooms. Mushrooms are another good forage item. That's right. Of course, you have to be careful because not all mushrooms are edible. So I'll put my PSA in here. If you go foraging, don't just eat anything you find. Be very sure of what you have in your hand before you put it in your body. All right, well, we'll talk a little bit about farming that enslaved workers did for themselves. So in addition to this farming that they're doing for the Masons or whichever family of people that owns them, they have to have their own separate garden plots. We have different documents that tell us some enslaved workers were assigned a particular amount of land by the person that owned them for this purpose specifically. Others were sort of allotted land that came with the area that they lived in, but they weren't allowed extra time. They had to fit it in to their already very limited schedule. So that means either working before you go out in the morning, when you come back at night, and most enslaved workers worked 6 days a week, if not 7. So that 7th day is often when they're doing a lot of the winter work in their gardens. However, there's a lot that can come from gardens that's good food. So we have just a couple examples up here on pictures. So one of them is the pawpaw fruit that I mentioned before that you could forage. The rest of them are things that you could grow in beds or in fields. One of them is the yam. So this is something just like the bird's eye peppers that many enslaved workers were familiar from in Africa. These are New World plants, so things that are native to the Americas that were brought from the Americas to Africa in the 17th century. And so when the enslaved Africans were taken from Africa to North America and the Caribbean area, they had already been exposed to these foods, and it became a mainstay of the kinds of food that they cooked. However, they're also coming into contact with different kinds of plants that Europeans were really familiar with, and they're getting seed from these European distributors. So you get things like big beans and turnips and peas and all sorts of other things. Some of these preserve very well. Root vegetables preserve very well. So you'll see our turnips there, which actually came from Gunston Hall. Turnips, potatoes, onions, all these things, if you can keep them dry and keep them cool, you can keep all winter long. So that's incredibly important for feeding yourself through the season where nothing is growing and it may be more difficult to forage. However, things like cabbage or other kinds of leafy greens, you're going to want to eat them fresh. However, you can pickle them, but you have to have access to something to pickle them in, like vinegar. So this is where we come to the idea that a lot of enslaved workers were going to buy or sell different kinds of goods. So the chickens that I mentioned, they could take chickens to market and sell those for a little extra money, or trade for something like vinegar instead, or extra molasses, or wheat, or whatever they might want. Now, there's a little bit of conjecture on our part. Some things are well documented, other things not so much. So at Gunston Hall, unfortunately, there's a bit of a gap for us. We don't have as much information about that. However, we do have information from places like Monticello and Mount Vernon, so we can assume that likely Mason was doing some of these same things. Now, I mentioned before that people are going to have to fit all this in. So this is a lot of work. You could have a full-time job doing just this, but the fact is that most of these enslaved workers were also doing other work. So a lot of this work gets divided down to those workers that we talked about before when we talked about who's receiving what kind of rations. So there's these workers who are working full-time, and then there are those who are considered weak hands who maybe are too old or are too young, and they're taking on all this labor to do this work. So we know that there are children who work on the mansion house. So Agnes and Sinark are two of them. They made the bricks that helped build that mansion. And when they weren't doing that, so after the mansion was finished, they likely were doing work in the farms to feed their families and feed the other enslaved workers. Peter and Sarah are two siblings that we know of, and they worked out on Mason's farms. So in addition to farming for Mason, they're also farming for the population of enslaved workers there. This is a group effort, and whether the food is being redistributed in rations or it's being distributed by the enslaved workers among themselves, it's all coming from this labor by people in bondage. So, do we have any questions about it? Nope, maybe not. I know that was a lot.
It's quite a bit of information to take in. If you have questions later and you want to address them in the chat or pop your mic on and ask us a question live, you're more than welcome to. I am keeping an eye on the time, and I do want to make sure that we get started with our next bit of activities. I do see the question in the chat. I'm going to get us loaded with our supplies for our next activity. So if you wish to follow along, you may want to have these supplies ready to go on your kitchen counter, and I will answer the question I see in the chat, which is, who cooked for slave families and which family members? That's a great question to which there is not one universal answer. We think that in some cases, women were cooking specifically for their families. Typically in African tradition, women are the keeper of the hearth. They are the cooks for every level of society. Whereas if we're looking at Western European peoples, by the time of the 18th century, having a well-trained male cook was often very prestigious, but they also recognized that women were often the more competent cooks, particularly in people who were enslaved. Who's cooking for the slave families themselves? we don't always know, because sometimes you have one person, they're pooling all of their ingredients, all of their cornmeal, all of the tomatoes that they're growing, and they're growing them, they're pooling all of these ingredients, and one person cooks for a big group of people. Sometimes on some plantations, it's the person or group of people working in the plantation kitchen. Not only are they cooking for the people in the main house, they're also cooking for lots of other people who work in and around the house who are enslaved. And sometimes it's on a family unit. We don't have a good answer at Gunston Hall. We don't have a good indication. We have found, archaeologically speaking, indications that there was cooking going on in the site for people who were enslaved that we know about, where probably people like Liberty and House Nell and some of the other people we've mentioned today were living, and they're getting their meal at that quarter. But we don't know for certain. Unfortunately, the record hasn't survived. So I'm going to give everyone just a moment more to get their ingredients set up. I'm going to go grab mine just so they're a little bit closer to where I'm going to be working. So bear with me for just a sec. All right, so here we are in my kitchen, and we are going to make a dish this morning called Kush. Kush is a dish that originated in Africa, started in large part in northeastern Africa and northwestern Africa, and has a connection with a dish you might be familiar with called couscous. Couscous, kush, kush, they're all dishes that come from the same basic heritage. So in your ingredients list, you saw that we wanted day-old cornbread. The drier it is, the more it will absorb moisture. So I already crumbled mine, so it's just ready for me to drop it in the pan when I'm ready. You also need some fat to cook with. I'm using modern day lard. In the 18th century, people who were enslaved often would be boiling their vegetables, cooking them very slowly in liquid, and they would have used that liquid as the thickening agent for lots of dishes, the liquid agent for lots of other dishes. Not regularly making pot liquor in my own kitchen today. I'm using chicken stock because that's what I have on hand. Seasoning wise, as you saw in one of those documents, people who were enslaved were getting salt. And they were growing things like the bird's eye peppers and other peppers, which we're going to mimic today with some crushed red pepper. They were also probably growing onions, which were introduced to them by Western Europeans. Onions come from the Mediterranean originally. I can't eat regular onions, they make me sick, so I am substituting in green onion today. But I know Laura is going to be cooking with some regular onions a little bit later this morning. So to start with, we want to get our heat going. So I'm turning on my burner to medium high, and I'm going to put my fat in. And I always find it's good to, ooh, check. Yes, because that's gone rancid. So we're not actually going to use that today. So I'm going to sub in some other oil, just what I have handy in the kitchen. And I'm going to add about a tablespoon or so into my pan. And I'm going to give that just a minute to heat up. I am cooking on cast iron today. I personally really like cast iron. It gives a nice even heat. You can shove it in the oven when you need to, And people in the 18th century of all social classes would have had cast iron cookware. Most people who were enslaved might have had just a few cast iron vessels, a pan like this one, although probably on feet so they could put it over a fire, and a big cast iron pot. You get that nice and hot. It retains its heat for a while, so even after you take it off the heat, it'll keep cooking. That's a good thing to know if you're cooking with cast iron and you're cooking something delicate. And now that my pan's heated, I find a good way to test is to put just a little splash of water in the pan, and if it sizzles, the pan's hot. So mine didn't. It's not quite hot enough yet. I do see a comment in the chat about couscous and Kush being related. It's this family of dishes in Western Africa where you've got some kind of staple starch, whether it's cornmeal or millet or sorghum or wheat, being mixed together and turned into this sort of combined mass. We see it a lot in a lot of places. It's really fascinating. Yeah, and Laura mentioned we do have a lot of dishes today that have their roots in 18th century cooking. The recipe we're cooking a little bit later, Laura and I started looking through cookbooks and we're like, oh, so that's essentially that recipe in my modern cookbook. All right, my water sizzled. So I'm gonna drop my onions in. And with your regular onions, this may take just a little bit longer. Basically what you wanna do is sweat them and just get them a little softened. You're not going for caramelized here. You're just working to get the oniony flavor into your oil so that it can be dispersed throughout the rest of the dish. So I can already smell the aroma of the onion coming up. That's the one downside to doing demonstrations like this is I can't share the smells with you. I'm sorry. All right. So we'll let that go for just a second. Does anyone have any thoughts or questions at this point? And if you would like to share them out loud, you're more than welcome to unmute yourself and do that as well.
We love your cooking show. This is fantastic. I'm cooking with you in the kitchen.
I'm glad you're enjoying it. I wish I could get you all out at Gunston Hall sometime soon. We'll get everyone back out there and we'll be able to do hearth cooking demonstrations in the hearth kitchen.
That would be exciting. We will all look forward to that.
So I'm seeing a question. Did people who were enslaved have special recipes for the holidays? That is a really fantastic question. And you know what? I don't know. It's one of the things that has really not survived. Let me pause there for just a second. I've got my cornbread now and I'm getting ready to chuck that in my pan. So we know in the 18th century that there were some special recipes for the holidays, not nearly so many and not quite the same connection to a specific holiday as what we experience in our modern kitchens. But Laura has pointed out in the chat, barbecue is definitely, it's not so much a special holiday recipe, but it is a special event recipe. And it was a special event recipe that started with people who were enslaved and was actually subsumed by the white gentry here in Virginia and in other places in Southern America. There are records of barbecues and discussions of how they were done in lots of 18th century and early 19th century American cookbooks. All right, so next up, I'm going to season. I'm gonna add a little bit of salt. I don't love things particularly salty, but in the 18th century, many dishes would have been fairly salty. If we think about today and how the labor, when we go outside and work on a day like today when it's fairly hot outside, and we're going to be sweating, we drink things that have electrolytes in them. And one of the things that people who were enslaved were doing, though they didn't realize it, was replenishing their electrolytes by eating food that had a fair amount of salt in it. Not that they had much choice about it, because a lot of the food that they were receiving had salt in it by virtue of the kind of food that it was. So I'm mixing up my dish now just to get all the flavors combined, to get a little bit of smokiness in my cornbread. And you can see it's really crumbly still. It's gonna fall out of the pan if I tip it much further. So the last step is to add some liquid, and that's where my stock comes in. So I have way more here than what I needed and what I gave you in the recipe. I find it's helpful to always have a little bit of extra because each recipe and each time I cook this, it comes out a little bit differently. So I always have a little bit of extra, at least a little bit of extra, so I have some more to toss in if I need it. You can also use water if you find you run out of liquid and you need to add more, not a problem. All right, so I'm gonna give this a little bit of a stir and let it cook down for a minute. Any other thoughts or questions while we're waiting on that to cook? You guys have had some amazing questions already, or really spot on, and I've been very excited to be answering them. Did they have or grow rice? That is a fantastic question, and yes, but not here. Rice is much more popular in the Carolinas along the banks of rivers. People in Africa had been growing rice for thousands of years before Western Europeans encountered them. They grew a strain of rice that creates a long staple rice that didn't stick. And sometime by about 1500, Asian varieties of rice were introduced into Africa, which are shorter grain, they're more sticky, and that was what was preferred there. But typically, a lot of the rice that we see in the United States today still comes from that African long staple grain. Uncle Ben's rice is one of those examples. Dairy foods is also coming up in the chat. People who were enslaved did not raise dairy cattle for themselves. There were people who were enslaved whose job was to raise dairy cattle for the family, the Mason family in this case, or the family who owned the plantation house. People who were enslaved did get dairy products sometimes. Not a whole lot of regular milk was consumed by Western Europeans in the 18th century. They ate a lot of cream, butter, cheese, ice cream, that kind of stuff, but they're not drinking straight milk. And sometimes people who were enslaved would be given the milk before it went bad. All right, so this sounds like it's ready, so I'm gonna pick it up so you guys can see it one more time. And then the real trial happens. I get to taste it. So you can see it sticking together a lot more now. It looks like what we would think of as cornbread dressing, and that is essentially what it is. So let me pop that back on, kill the heat. So good.
That looks fantastic.
It's one of my favorite dishes since I got introduced to it in about 2007. Oh, and I just got that kicky heat right in the back of my mouth. So if anyone has any other thoughts or questions about Kush, feel free to pop them into the chat. But I want to turn it over to Laura to do our last recipe of the day. So let me pop on screen the supplies that you may want if you want to follow along. Our next dish is called Okra and Tomatoes.
And you may notice that we have two different spellings, and it was something interesting that I learned this time, which is, we have different spellings sometimes in 18th century recipes than we do today. And okra is one of them that underwent a little bit of a change depending on your publisher. And so we took our recipe from a cookbook by a woman named Mary Randolph. And she spelt it as the way you see in the title, Okra and Tomatoes. There's not necessarily a right or wrong definitively, so we used both.
And we will look at her recipe in just a second.
She has a very straightforward recipe. This is a recipe that is very typical of the 18th century in that it is quite bare bones, shall we say. They tend to be very direct and say, this is what you do, but they also expect you to have a certain level of knowledge coming into it, which sometimes works out really well for modern cooks. Other times it is difficult for modern cooks.
So why don't we flip over and take a look?
Here we go. So okra and tomatoes. Take an equal quantity of each. Let the okra be young. Slice it and skin the tomatoes. Put them in a pan without water. Add a lump of butter, an onion chopped fine, some pepper and salt, and stew them 1 hour. Now, fortunately, we are not going to take an hour to do this, but keep in mind that given that this would have been cooked in a hearth, in a cast iron, over coals, sometimes it takes longer to cook things, but even still, a lot of these are not hard and fast rules. These recipes are more like guidelines. But you'll notice we've included the page from which the recipe was taken. That's on the left side of your screen. And it was included with other recipes like gumbo and pepper pot. And so where she chose to put this recipe in the recipe book shows us sort of how white authors thought about this, that this was something that was very much part of the diet of enslaved people, particular to these Africans and African Americans. However, later on, we start to see this recipe move in cookbooks, and it starts to show up in the vegetable section with everything else. And so it's being subsumed, like Lacey said earlier, by the white gentry. They're bringing it to their table, just like things like catfish, which started out as no food, becomes something that you would put on your table.
I have the worst time finding this recipe when I go to look for it in the cookbook, because I always expect for it to be in the vegetable section. But it's not. It's in this weird little unnamed section that has these 3 recipes right in a row that we know have African inspiration. And the one before it, where you can see the tail end of it talking about curry powder, is based on East Indian, the country of India, curry dishes. And there's also 3 or 4 Spanish dishes in this cookbook. So we've got lots of influences coming from other places. And the question that I keep asking myself, is this something that Mary Randolph, the woman who wrote this cookbook, encountered in the population of enslaved people she owned at her plantation? Or did it come to her through a ship's captain who was regularly coming from the Caribbean to Virginia? And that's why it's in this section of the cookbook. But this is absolutely 100% an African-inspired dish.
All right, so we'll get started. Luckily, this one is very, very straightforward. So this is pretty much a one-pot dish. I've gone ahead and chopped up everything, but I'm going to show you all the different parts. So we're going to move my camera, so bear with me for a second while we adjust. So you can see my pan. So I have got a non-stick pan because I realized that my cast iron was going to be just a smidge too small for this. So first of all, our star of the show, okra. So mine's all chopped up here. I'll try to hold it up so you can see. It has this lovely sort of star shape, lots of big seeds in it. You can see that the rind is kind of thick. And what it looks like before it's been cut, I've got a big one and a small one here. So they look kind of like little talons. Sometimes you see them called lady fingers. But they grow on a big bushy plant. And if you do it right, they grow like wild. So you'll notice that the recipe said equal parts okra and tomato, so I've already gone ahead and taken care of my tomato. They want you to skin them. So I did mine by taking a pot of boiling water. Each tomato, and these are smallish plum tomatoes or Roma tomatoes, made an X cut into them, dropped them in the boiling water for about 30 to 45 seconds, and then put them into an ice bath. This causes the skin to kind of pucker up and loosen, and you can actually sort of shred it off. And then you've got this nice skinless tomato, which you can chop up into whatever size you want. My pieces are about big, about the same size as the okra. Our onion is likewise been chopped up beautifully. You can see I am using a regular white onion. You could use red, you could use yellow. There is no limitation on what kind of onion you use. And we have pepper and salt, and I've gone ahead and mixed mine together. This is about a teaspoon of each. However, like Lacey said before, you can adopt this to however you like it. So I'm going to turn my heat onto medium, and we're going to put, as Mary Randolph puts it, a lump of butter. Now our lump of butter today is going to be about 2 tablespoons, so I've gone ahead and chopped mine a little bit. And it's been sitting out and warming a little bit, so got a little bit left over. And luckily, my burner comes up to heat pretty quick, so it's already starting to slide a little bit. But we want to let that butter melt down a bit before we put everything in, so that way you don't get butter in just one spot. Let's see, do we have any questions so far? I have to scroll down because I tilted my screen.
I got you, Laura. We don't.
Very good, thank you.
But we were talking about all of the influences appearing in those recipes, and we absolutely are seeing some Southeast Asian heritage in some of the recipes that we're looking at. And my comment was that the more I learn about history, the more I learned that many people were in fact global citizens. It just took longer for the information to pass its way around the world.
Yeah, we see a lot of interesting transfer to, like we sort of mentioned before, between these dishes that are considered foreign to English culture, at first being seen as, not something that's a bit of a novelty, and then it changes into something that becomes a mainstay of food. So today, fried okra is soul food. It's something, if you've lived in the South for any length of time, you would be familiar with. Even if you haven't eaten it yourself, you've certainly heard of it. Barbecue is another one that became very entrenched and went from being something that was largely eaten by enslaved Africans to something that everyone eats.
Absolutely.
All right, so my butter's melting nicely, so I'm gonna go ahead and start adding in all my ingredients. Luckily, they can all pretty much go in together. I like to do my onions first. And I'm not quite hot enough yet, so it'll take a minute to get up, but we are approaching it. But I like to get my butter spread all over my onions. And if you wait until your butter is sort of browned and caked on, you can't spread it nicely, so. I like buttery onions.
Butter and onions is one of the best flavors in the world, in my personal opinion, and it makes me really, really sad that I can't eat onions like that anymore.
The smell of it alone right now is very tempting. Luckily, this is a dish that cooks pretty quickly, so you don't have to wait very long. But yeah, it's definitely one of those things that as soon as you put it in, you go, oh, that smell. I'm ready to eat it now.
Mm-hmm. So this recipe was one that was really fascinating for us, Laura, because neither of us, when we first started looking at it, had heard about it.
The okra tomatoes?
Yeah, the okra and tomatoes. And then you and I started doing research trying to figure out what should this dish look like. And we opened how many cookbooks?
Quite a few, and I did a bit online searching as well to see what people's blogs and such said, and yeah, we were quite surprised to find how many recipes are almost identical to this. Today, usually this is referred to as stewed okra and tomatoes. And you do see some recipes that sometimes they call for adding water to make it a bit wetter. But this one says don't bother. And part of that is the tomatoes and the onions are wet enough on their own. And the okra is very gooey. So anyone who's had okra before is familiar with that. If you're not, okra has a bit of a slime to it, which for some people, they're not big fans of. Other people quite like it. But because it's wet enough on its own, I wouldn't necessarily want to go adding a whole bunch of water to it or anything else, but I could see where you might substitute other kinds of liquids in to change the flavor a little bit. So. My heat's being stubborn today, so as we're waiting for this to come up. Luckily, once it's up to temp, it's about 15 minutes to do the whole thing. Very simple, very easy. And fortunately too, once it's cooked, you can either serve it right away or you can freeze it. So for a modern world of leftovers where we have refrigeration as an option, this is a nice dish that you'd be able to set aside and have later in the week if you decided you accidentally cooked too much, or if you do like I do sometimes and you want to have something for lunch later in the week and you make a lunch earlier. Ta-da!
This is also one of those dishes that shows the capacity that people who were enslaved had to be cooking food. So is the Kush. We find lots of recipes in Western European cookbooks that take forever to make.
Yeah, and so when you start thinking about why that might be, it makes sense that you get dishes that are either quick and easy to cook or that don't require a lot of hands-on attention. So dishes that incorporate leftovers are popular, but also dishes that are one pot, put it in the pot, as long as you keep it warm, it'll keep going. So I'm starting to sizzle now. I don't know if anyone over, any of y'all can hear it, but I
can't hear it, but I can see it.
I was gonna say, yeah. Well, we could hear your pan sizzling, Lacey, so that's why I was like, I don't know if they can hear mine or not, but, but you also had oil in yours, so.
I did.
So we'll give it another second.
Does anyone have any thoughts or questions about either of these two recipes? Sorry, as I sit here and eat my Kush in the background because it's amazing.
We're living vicariously through you, Lacey.
It all looks great. Of course, if we were making the Kush today, it would be great with sausage in it. But I know you that the slaves didn't have access to much protein.
Yeah, and they found protein in different ways. They had beans. They had they used a lot of grains that had protein in and of themselves. Oop, Laura just dropped in her tomatoes. I can hear the sizzle now.
It'll be back.
And they added what protein they could. There's a great dish that starts appearing in early 19th century cookbooks called Brunswick stew, which we believe probably, yes, it is very good. We believe probably started in the kitchens of people who were enslaved because it's a really low, slow cook. The dish originally had squirrel meat in it. Today, most people make it with chicken. And you boil the meat very low. And Laura's putting in her salt and pepper and her okra in there now. That's looking tasty.
Yeah, so now everything's in there.
Dun, dun, dun.
I'm saving back a little bit of my seasoning so I can add a little bit more as I stir. But I just gave it a nice even shake over everything. And you want to make sure that you do stir this so that way everything doesn't get stuck to the bottom of your pan since it is a bit gooey. But you don't have to stir vigorously as I toss a single piece of okra out of my pan. Do as I say, not as I do.
So Brunswick stew, chicken or squirrel in the 18th century. And you stew the meat on very low temperature, basically until the meat starts falling off the bones. You pick the meat off, dump it back in the pot, put in lima beans, which have some protein in them, okra, which helps bind and make the dish a little bit thicker, typically corn and tomatoes, both Native American products that people who were enslaved had become familiar with. And in this case, we're talking about like fresh sweet corn, not corn used for making cornmeal. And you let it sit there and basically just meld the flavors, and it can cook on low temp forever. And that was one of the ways that they could make protein that they did have stretch really far, and get it out, get what they could out of it. And like Laura said, they're hunting, they're also scavenging. There was one resource I was looking at where the young man in question just had this, the height of his anticipation and risk was swiping something off the plate that was going from the big kitchen to the main house. And so they're stealing things where they can as well.
Yeah, there's an instance in which Washington writes about one of his storehouses that he believes has been broken into by enslaved workers. And so he realized that it's discovered that there's a board loose on the side of the building. And that was how different cuts of meat were being carried off. Mm-hmm. So enslaved workers were using these, small acts of rebellion as ways to feed themselves, things that they normally wouldn't have had access to.
So I'm looking at the time and I see we've hit the magic hour. We'll keep going until Laura's okra and tomatoes are done. But for those of you who need to pop off, thank you so much for participating with us this morning. It's been great fun having you with us, looking at this really interesting and sometimes very challenging topic, and honoring the people who were enslaved at Gunston Hall, like Nell, Pris, Liberty, Agnes, Kaja, James, and helping to bring the tastes and the flavors that they would have been encountering to life. We are continuing with our Summer Saturdays series through the end of August. Our next Summer Saturday will be archaeology themed. We'll be bringing you virtually to our active dig site at Gunston Hall. Very excited about that one. And we will also be doing a couple of more games themed sessions in August, one more gardening themed session. And on August 15th, Laura and I will be coming back to the screen to talk about food for tenant farmers, people who worked land that George Mason owned, but were not either servants or people who were enslaved. So we'll be looking at more food later in August. So those of you who need to pop off, thank you so much for joining us, and we hope to have you back. Those of you who can stay, you're welcome to hang out with us and see how the okra and tomatoes comes out. It's looking really good.
It smells really good. The last time I did this, when I did my test cook, the colors were so beautiful when it was done. I can imagine this being very good with rice too. So if you had rice, you could do this with a little rice. But what's funny is, and it may not be as visible to y'all, but you can actually see that sort of goo that the okra gives off, and it does kind of help bind things together really nicely. And so sometimes okra gets used as almost like a thickening agent in different recipes. So that's why I said I like that this one does not include water for stewing, because it allows the okra to act as it wants to. But right now, all I have there in terms of extra flavoring is salt and pepper. Now, enslaved workers could forage for different kinds of things. They could grow some of their own herbs depending on access. Luckily, a lot of herbs, you can propagate them quite easily. So if they have one person who has them, somebody else could easily propagate from that. Some of these herbs are used not only in culinary ways, but in medicinal ways as well. So it's kind of interesting when you get into 18th century food flavors, particularly herbal ones being used by people who cannot afford the imported spices. A lot of those actually serve sort of double duty.
Mm-hmm. And fun stuff, our garden theme summer Saturday next month, we're actually going to talk about propagating.
Exciting.
Yeah, very excited about that. We're looking at some really cool activities right now.
I always feel very magical whenever I manage to propagate something. Like, look at this, I made it happen. It worked. And my mint is usually like, no, I did all the work.
Well, mint propagates itself willy-nilly.
It does. It does. Other things, not quite as easily. Mint is a great place to start if you're feeling at all unsure about it. Mm-hmm. So I turned up my heat a little bit, depending on what stove you cook on, but you want it somewhere in the mid-range. You don't want it too high, because this is kind of a low and slow sort of cook. It's not a flash cook. But the last time I cooked this, it was on a different stovetop. That one handled a very medium-low heat. This stove is a little bit higher, but I'm also cooking in a different pan. Yeah. So keep in mind that depending on your pan, don't be afraid to adjust it. But everything is sizzling really well, nice and even, and that's exactly what we're looking for.
And part of what we want to have happen in this dish is for the liquid essentially to cook out. We don't want it, the reason you don't want to flash heat it is you don't want to caramelize the butter or the okra, the tomatoes, or the onions, because then they won't release liquid in the same way. And you'll get a very different flavor palette. And a different texture out of it as well. But it's looking really good, Laura.
Yeah, I'm very pleased. Like I said, it's kind of it's a nice recipe in that you don't have to give it a ton of attention. It doesn't need to be super babied, which, as I said before, when you consider that a lot of cooking was being done either in a hurry or by children who couldn't, who might not be able to handle more difficult dishes. Mm-hmm. Something like this where it's chop up these vegetables, put it in, give it a stir is very useful. Or for someone who maybe is caring for children, if someone is an elderly enslaved worker, like old Nangate, if she's looking after children and she's having to split her attention, something like this is a good option.
Absolutely.
And I've got a lot of steam coming off of it, which is great. So all of that liquid is working its way out.
And this one in some ways can also be that really slow, put it on super low heat, let it sit. You can let it sit for an hour and basically let it do its own thing and stir it only like 3 or 4 times in an hour.
Yeah.
And you should still get the same results.
Yeah, we've modified a little bit for our time constraints. This could be like the Netflix channels that they have where it's just something really slow going on in the background. For Dunstan, it'll just be okra cooking.
Asmer videos, absolutely.
Yeah, we'll do some nice slow cooking. We can do pottage next time. I will say okra gets a bad rep for being kind of slimy and sticky and gooey, but it's a really pretty vegetable too when you get down to it. It's very visually satisfying.
I love okra. And I think it's really fascinating. It's a vegetable that people who were enslaved often used as a substitute for yams. Today, what we call yams in the United States are actually sweet potatoes. And in the 18th century in Africa, and still in Africa today, they're using a very different root vegetable, which is properly called a yam. They're totally different genuses. And they adopt both sweet potatoes and okra, use more okra here in the United States because of that soft, somewhat slimy texture. They use a lot of that in Western Africa, where they pound the yam basically into mush, and it's got this very gelatinous texture to it, and they make lots of dishes with this vegetable. So it's got this really fun and fascinating history, okra does, but I mean, I also think it's delicious.
Of course, later on, today we get fried okra, and sometimes that's done in a corn batter. So even what it's being paired with today are things that it would have traditionally been paired with in the 18th century.
You're starting to look good. I see the tomatoes starting to break down.
Yeah, I was gonna say my tomatoes are getting squishy and beautiful. Yeah, everything's getting nice and soft. I'm kind of poking at it with my stick here. Oh yeah, that's nice and tender. I'm gonna poke at my okra. I think it's ready. You could let it go for a little while longer if you like everything super duper soft, but I honestly like mine a little al dente, so.
Most people do.
Yeah, so I'm gonna call that. I'm gonna say that is finished, and then just let it cool off here with the residual heat, because it won't hurt it at all. But you could go ahead and put that in a bowl if you were gonna serve it up, and then have at it. And that's how you do okra and tomatoes. Which is really okra, tomatoes, and onion. Onion got the short end of the stick.
I was so surprised when I opened that one book up, Laura, the Better Homes and Gardens. That was the cookbook both Laura and I have.
Yeah.
And I opened it up thinking, maybe there's going to be something like this, but probably not. And I opened up the index and found this dish called smothered okra. Yes. And when I flipped it to the page, what was on it? Okra and tomatoes.
It's very interesting which dishes just haven't changed that much. But yeah, and we were also laughing that, we have the various editions of that particular cookbook, and that some things just don't change. Some things have self-regulated so much that everyone's decided, no, this is the way that we do it. And
yeah,
that's what you get.
Absolutely.
Were there any last questions about the okra and tomatoes, or any other topics?
I want to know if you're going to taste it.
Oh, I was going to say on camera? Well, of course it's super hot because it's sitting here on the table, so we're going to have to make sure I don't burn my mouth on camera.
I don't know if you saw me blowing on the Kush before I took a bite.
That's better than the first time I made it. Like the first time I was kind of feeling unsure about it. But I think I did better on the seasoning this time. The having the pepper definitely helps it. I was a little too shy on the pepper last time. So.
Well, thank you so much, everybody, for participating. We're very excited to have you. I'm glad you guys have been enjoying it. You should go out and try these yourselves. All of the recipes will be up on our website along with this video. in a week or so. We currently have every recorded summer Saturday through July 4th up on the website, and I'm working to get July 11th and July 18th up today. And we hope you enjoy trying out all of the activities that we've been talking about for Summer Saturdays. So thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to having you next time.